Well, welcome. This is FearTalk 19. I'm Dr. R. Michael Fisher, and I'm here today to really continue this conversation I started about 6 years ago on having great conversations in depth, broad and wide, and really around the topic of fear and fearlessness and combinations thereof. Today, I have a really special guest occurring from, I think you're down in San Francisco. Are you, Kirk?
That's right.
Okay.
Very.
So Kirk Schneider, I'll do a little intro to him, and I'm not going to do a big bio, Kirk. I like people. I'll just
Fine.
do links on the bottom so that we take our time for a real conversation, and
Absolutely.
that's what I'm really happy to have. So very quick and briefly, I'm going to ask you, Kirk, and I'm going to answer the question. My question first is, that'd be interesting to start with. Who is one of my ancestors that I can remember who actually influenced my ability to appreciate a term that you've used, experiential democratic dialogue? So who had characteristics for what I would call experiential democratic dialogue? It's a term that Kirk will describe later in this presentation, and I'm going to ask Kirk that same. Who might be an ancestor he drew on? So one is my uncle of my father's uncle. They were farmers, and he was a Christian evangelical of all things. I was not, and our family wasn't, but he was very, very Christian evangelical. And he was amazing because every time we'd go there in the summer as a young person, I would always be amazed at his slow presence.
Mm.
So he carried this gait, this way he held his body, the way he ate his food, the way he pulled out the Bible readings, every morning for breakfast to the whole table. And I was just like, for a urban kid, from big city, is like, what is this? It was so, and yet he never ever tried to convert me. And so
Uh,
I appreciate that that was to me really democratic,
uh-huh.
and he gave me so much space to be myself. I was never threatened by him.
Right.
That's
Right.
my ancestor.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
How about you?
Oh, well, there's a number of people I could draw on. I definitely feel that my father was an example of somebody who engaged in those kind of dialogues, really encouraged me and others to see each other as human beings rather than stereotypes or just what our immediate reaction that we have towards somebody. And actually, I remember an incident when I was a little kid, maybe 7 or so, and I joined a gang of kids. This was one of the really uh, profound blemishes on my character, but joined a bunch of kids who were making fun of a kid of color in our neighborhood. It was a working class, pretty much white neighborhood. This kid, I don't think he was African American, but maybe Italian or something. In any case, I joined those kids out of peer pressure. This is the one time I remember my father actually slapping me. He proceeded to pull me out of the crowd and put me on his lap and gave me a few slaps on the butt. But then very clearly and very thoughtfully explained to me the seriousness of what I was engaged in and how would I feel if a gang of kids came after me because of, let's say, our Jewish background. We were the only Jews in the whole neighborhood, actually.
Right.
Quite secular, but
Okay.
nevertheless. And I never forgot that incident. And that was the only time, I believe, that my dad actually struck me. Maybe one of two times, but
Is that story in your new book called Life Enhancement Anxiety?
life enhancing anxiety. No, that particular story is not,
Not
but
published?
could have been. Um, yeah, I'm sure I've written about it elsewhere, but I think of him. I think of Martin Luther King as a
Yeah.
model of somebody who would engage in this. He gave a great speech about Mastering Our Fears.
Oh,
He talked about a woman, a white woman he sat with on an airplane, and they engaged in a very humanizing conversation uh, that that helped them both to kind of disarm and treat each other more as human beings rather than colors.
yeah.
It was a beautiful speech, and believe it or not, it may sound a little, I don't know, trite, but Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird had that quality to me. And I kind of grew up with some of those stories of, Atticus Finch being such a humanistic lawyer and trying to help an African American man who was accused of rape in the town. Very powerful.
So Kirk Schneider, if people don't know, he is someone who I consider certainly a long-term advocate for the existential humanistic tradition, particularly in psychology and psychotherapy. He has his own institute now, a founder of some years ago, Existential Humanistic Institute, many other things. But really today, I'm going to see if I can describe what I think a FearTalk is, and then you can just respond to it, I think, to start us and get us warmed up. But Kirk has some really interesting ideas, word terms like enchanted agnosticism. I always thought fun. That was interesting. And then this one about fluid center. I think your 1999 paper really caught my eye. I said, I haven't read it, but it's the fluid center,
Yes.
a third millennium challenge to culture. And that's where I really feel like, whoa, I haven't read that paper, but I think that's where Kirk and I are really, I'm just picking up. This is a resonance I feel with you and have for a long time is we are not only individual therapeutically interested in helping people, we are serious interested in a therapy for our culture. And
Yes.
That's a dangerous word to throw out today. What is culture? Whose culture? But just in general, we're both North Americans. I'll leave it at that. Born and raised here, and certainly I hear you have a Jewish background as well. My mother is really an immigrant from Belgium. I was the first, she came here as a war bride, and so I know what it feels like to be in an new immigrant family, a mother who doesn't speak English well, and I saw how she got treated in Canada, right? Supposedly. But this is ethnocentrism. It's everywhere.
And fear of the other.
Fear of the other, which
That's
will be
very
really
primal. Yeah.
Yep. So FearTalk to me really is my form or way to create what I call a dialogical curriculum. And I want people to witness these talks. That's why we record them. I want them to then think about how could that be modeled. So we in dialogue, experientially, dialogically, even philosophically and theoretically. In that dialogue, we are actually practicing. This is the actual practice of being human. And I know that's a really important word in the humanistic tradition. So not to be taken lightly. And I know you write in your book, you've had a lot of attacks, a lot of criticism from postmodern thinkers, post-colonial thinkers, post-humanists. I can just imagine the kind of enemies, quote, and I'm quoting enemies in a compassionate way.
Right.
And I have had many myself of those kinds of attacks for the work I do. So this curriculum was really, for me, I ended up tagging it as fear management education is what we need for the third millennium. And that really was my 2010 book, came out of my dissertation work, came out of another 10 years before I ever went to grad school of the study of fear and all the relations related to it. So I then came up with the term fear working. And I like that term a lot as one word, fear working. I'm kind of like you. I like to create new terms, new phrases. So I really recognize that in your book. You're constantly creating these new little ways, right? To speak when vocabulary is part of critical literacy. I'm an educator. You're a therapist, but I know you're also a theorist. I think you're a philosopher. I think you're obviously a practitioner of the work you do as well. and
Yes,
you teach
I
other
agree.
practitioners, so we're both educators. And again, there's another alignment I'm just pulling here.
Mhm.
So this fear management education, to give it a term that I thought a lot of people could kind of get a handle on that term. And you can see I'm not staying in the field of psychology here. I'm just really spreading the wings to the culture. How am
Yeah,
I going to do that cultural therapeutic or therapia type work in
yeah,
all kinds of dimensions? So fear
right.
working seemed a really good term because people are using conflict work. I was seeing people using conflict work. I'm a conflict worker. And I said, well, I'm a fear worker.
Uh-huh,
I thought,
uh-huh,
oh, why don't
uh-huh.
we
Ah,
educate people to be fear workers?
I like that
And then
actually.
it's
Yeah.
also got this fun play of you're actually working fear, so fear works for you. Right? Fear works. You're
Uh-huh,
working.
uh-huh.
You're
Yeah,
working. What do
yeah,
you
yeah.
think of that?
I like it. I like it. I often have groped for words to describe what I do, especially with this experiential democracy dialogue. I work with braver angels, who are trying to translate psychological ideas to the social arena. But it's often called conflict management. You're right,
Yep.
or conflict mediation.
Uh,
So fear worker or fear working does it feels like it really does address more of the heart of what I'm attempting to do as well with these one-on-one experiential democracy dialogues, because it is so much about fear. And this is what I talk about when I talk about these engagements: is we got to get to fear, and especially primal fear to the degree we can, if we're going to have any hope of achieving longer term, more in depth forms of relationships among people of very diverse backgrounds. Because if we're just trying to give each other scripts to say, or some kind of formulation, um,
Often moral codes to practice.
moral codes, yeah, to practice, then I fear that we are doing something like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And this is so much of our society too, our so-called democratic society. It's a beautiful idea, and we have achieved some great things in it. I mean, behaviorally and physically, we are much more democratic, I would say, than we were 200 years ago, right? At least in terms of general, behavior, et cetera. I mean, we have we have overcome slavery, certainly in the literal sense, in a lot of ways. On the other hand, I think we've not gone very far in terms of our basic ways of being with each other, uh, human to human. In other words, our inner lives are not really in alignment with that democratic sensibility. I don't think. I think our inner lives are still very caught in all kinds of prejudices, stereotypes, and primal fears that I write about in the book.
Yeah. So the curriculum, right? That's democratic civic education. And there's a whole section in a quarter of that course, 25% ought
Uh-huh.
to be on how to deal with from ontological primal anxiety to fear to
Yeah,
culture of fear. That would be an education. Yeah, we're going to actually give our students, young people, a chance to actually understand this fundamental drive. This, I call it a meta motivator.
that's a good,
Fear
good word.
ecology is another term. You can see I'm constantly looking for vocabulary that
Yeah.
could perhaps give us a different imaginary. So I look at this term of what is your fear imaginary? Do
Oh,
you understand that? How have and then give people a chance to start thinking that through, thinking it
uh-huh.
out, right? So this imaginary is different than imagination per se, although they're related concepts. The fear imaginary is much more about what does your culture, your conditioning, your historical discourses that
Mhm,
you are
mhm.
situated within, How has it allowed a particular imagination of fear, but not allowed other imaginations of fear? Now
Well,
you start to
yeah,
get a hold of that, and you start to get a sense of that conceptual, right? The philosophical, conceptual, even spiritual imprisonment
yes,
of your own ability to imagine a different relationship with fear working.
yes,
That
yes.
would just be one way to frame um, one of the educative purposes and needs. And I know you have this term that's really interesting. We'll get to it today later. I want you to do your little reading right now. I ask you to pick, Kirk.
Okay.
I know I'm pushing along here because we only have 40 minutes.
Oh, right, right. Okay.
I'm always
But
conscious of that.
you're bringing up all kinds of
I'll bet.
ideas that are resonating for me. So I
I'll
really
bet.
appreciate what you're
So
saying about
we'll give you
education.
lots of time to respond. So you bring
Okay.
up a key word, I'll just hook you on it too, but you're going to introduce, I think, a quote from your book, your newest book.
Yes.
And so just, when I give you a go ahead, just give the whole title of the book and where people can get it. But
Okay.
you use a term awe-based education. I was reading this morning and I just went, whoa, I want to be involved in what that is. What is that? I'm an educator, right? I'm a curriculum PhD, I'm a designer, a philosopher of education. And
Yes.
I'm starting to ask, how is that related to fearlessness
Yes.
education, fear management education in a fearlessness paradigm? So
Yes.
that's my articulation. That was my PhD research, and all the educators went, "Oh, that's interesting. I hope you get a job." And they didn't say that, and I didn't get a job.
That's typical. Yeah. A typical
Okay,
reaction. Yeah.
so we'll leave it to you if you want to start with your quote or if you want to just jump in and react to anything else. But why don't you just start with a feeling for your book? Give us a sense of the voice of that book, the passion with it, anything you want to add to it. Just go for it. We'll listen to you.
Thank you. Well, this is from Life Enhancing Anxiety, Key to a Sane World. And it's actually the introduction, which is titled What the World Needs Now, Life Enhancing Anxiety. It seems counterintuitive. Anxiety is going through the roof in our time. And yet this book advances the notion that there is not enough anxiety, at least of a certain kind. People are laboring in the thousands, maybe millions, with anxiety disorders. There is a war going on in Ukraine. Authoritarianism is on the rise, and climatic disaster is upon us. These crises are driven by, as well as perpetuating, anxiety. And yet this volume raises the prospect that the crises are the result of avoidance of a certain type of anxiety. I call this life-enhancing anxiety. As we will see, life-enhancing anxiety is the anxiety we must face to prevent life-destroying anxiety. It is challenging and requires pluck, but it also may just save us from the disastrous path with which we now contend. So, what do I mean by life-enhancing anxiety? Well, my formal definition is it's a form of anxiety that enables us to live with and make the best of the depth and mystery of existence. Now, that's a mouthful, but basically what I'm saying here is that we have such skyrocketing rates of anxiety and destructiveness as a result of it, precisely because we're not facing the prior and more primal and more substantial challenges of anxiety earlier on. And those have to do with the big questions of living. Like, how are we going to live our lives, given that we're all dying at the same time as we're living? We're thrown toward death. We're a flash between two voids. How are we going to tap into that? make the best of that. What really matters about our individual lives and the lives of our collective, the people around us, and living with people around us? What's the purpose and meaning of our lives? By not addressing these very primal questions and not being encouraged and provided the skills to work with these kinds of often uncomfortable, yet, deeply rewarding, I believe, in the long run, issues, we often end up with all kinds of fears and being driven by all kinds of fears. At the core, the fear of the unknown, I would say. That to me is anxiety. And so we're driven, our society is so driven by fear of the unknown, fear of that which is different and other. That which can bring discovery. A way to summarize it is, I think our society is riven by the quick fix, instant result model for living. We're desperate for answers, and they're often very superficial answers, but they're very seductive because they keep us from addressing these less comfortable, but again, potentially much more enriching and rewarding questions that relate to life-enhancing anxiety. So I trace a lot of this back, actually, in the spirit of Otto Rank to our birth. I think we all experience this primal anxiety right from the get-go. That radical shift from relative non-being and unity to sudden abrupt being and pandemonium is the template, in my view, for virtually all subsequent anxiety and trauma. And even transmitted trauma, which I think you were speaking to before, that occurs generation over generation, even century over century, that we're often not very conscious of either, but we're still holding it. And you add to that the traumas and fears of our present living, and you've got a lot of fear-driven encounters between the newborn, who is initially shocked and jarred by the newness that they come into, the strange people, the place, the lights, the colors. I mean, it's overwhelming, I believe, at first. And yet, how are we met? That is the fundamental question. How are we met by our caretakers and by the culture that surrounds us? And unfortunately, tragically, we're too often met by fear-driven attitudes, which just add to the trauma, or I'd say the drama of birth, because I think there are elements of wonder and discovery in it too.
Yeah. And of course, that's sort of the foundation of our understanding of what is care and trust. Eric
Exactly.
Erickson, right? First stage of emotional affective development.
Yes.
Will the world be trustable?
Yes.
Will it be will I mistrust the world? And
And
that,
with
yeah. So
holding environment. Yeah.
the holding environment, and that you see that in my work in the research on when I started researching fear in this very transdisciplinary way. Really, I made that commitment very early on, and so I would just look at all kinds of literature. So I did a lot of the world religious traditions, right, and philosophies, and you started seeing this idea of love and fear showing up. I would see it on almost virtually all the it's kind of like a perennial philosophical principle of you need to negotiate that
Yes.
with or without a god or other
Yes.
spiritual center or a transpersonal perspective or existential perspective. You still need to negotiate that, because that will filter, that will create that template which is really like Erickson. He was doing it at more an individual level, but
Right.
will I trust the world? Will it be a loving, caring world? Or will the care be, maybe care here, but we don't care for anybody else?
Exactly.
So there's the fear-based condition,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So love and fear played out and continues to play out an interesting part of my process. And then why I introduced the word fearlessness, a lot of different reasons. That's a huge, long topic, but I began to realize, well, that fear and love is just a little bit too far apart. Like, even trust and miss part. It's like, what about all that in between space of the lived experience of negotiating
Yes.
between those kind of more philosophical or metaphysical ideas even?
Yes.
That's where fearlessness appeared for me. I said, basically, okay, I want a path from that fear-based condition, let's say the hurt condition, the traumatized condition, even if it's unconscious. But one can eventually maybe come to realize and get that opening out of the frozenness.
Yes.
Right? That paralyzation, the frozenness, the denial in Becker's ideas and so on.
Yeah.
And then actually begin that path. And then, Becker would call that, well, that's the hero's journey. That is that ultimate impulse that we are more than that victimization, right? That injury, the narcissistic wound of birth and all these things. And that, so I was really arcing the path of fearlessness always is in between that polarity of from fear-based to a love-based reality.
I like that.
Yeah, it's very different than thinking of fearlessness, which one of the things I noticed, and when I use that language in North American context, people immediately put it in a behavioral context. Fearlessness, they want to box it immediately. Oh, well, they're fearless. They're just kind of as an exaggerated courage or bravery. So they keep using that kind of conceptualization. And I'm trying to say, whoa, no. What about a path of fearlessness? Now you've got basically, yes, it has a behavioral component, but it also has a virtues component.
Yes.
It has an ontological component of action. What do you believe the universe is made of? This is your perceptual cosmic lens, right? This is where it's like a cosmology. And so fearlessness to me is ever expanding. And I think it can
That's beautiful.
Definitely be part of the wonder, the awe, the mystery of, right? If you move out of that encapsulated fear-based place, well, what's going to happen? You're only going to come out because there's something desirable.
Yes.
and you have the impulse to recognize beauty.
Yes.
Follow desire for what? A higher quality of experiencing.
And inner freedom.
And then inner freedom with that, right? Because you're expanding.
Yes.
Like freedom is just, it's an expansive verb. It's not, to me, a fixed noun. Just like fearlessness is not a noun.
It's transitive.
It's always transitive, moving. That's where you're working. You're fear working along the path of fearlessness. Now, somebody said to me, well, why don't you just use path of love? You'd probably be a lot more successful, like how people would read your work. And I said, well, the problem I have with the love thing, especially in education, right? Oh yeah, well, they really want to put the word love in there and caring and all those really positive things in their education philosophy. And I was really battling that for sure, when I came on the scene. Anyways, the basic idea was, I said, I think the problem with love, and I just intuited this, was it's too easy to forget about fear.
Yeah.
When you're pursuing the positive, right?
That's why I named my book Life Enhancing Anxiety, precisely because I don't think we acknowledge the many dimensions of that challenge in our lives. And as a result, we've got a great deal of destructiveness. Because being in uncomfortable conversations or dealing with uncomfortable ideas, coming to some terms with otherness is a path to a fuller, richer, more vital life, in my view, and many people who resonate with this. And I sense that's a lot of where you're coming from too.
Very much so. Fearless,
highlighting fear.
Yeah, the idea is that fear is always going somewhere. So that's why I like putting fearlessness with fear. And I don't want to talk about one without the other. That's sort of fundamental to
I
my
guess
teaching.
I would, the way
Go
I
for it.
frame that is in terms of what I would call finding ground within groundlessness.
Nice. Yeah.
And expanding that ground as one expands into the groundlessness of existence, that helplessness and groundlessness we first experience when we come out of existence. And the more we can be present, the more we can feel connected to our whole body experience, even though we are also acutely aware that we're in an ungrounded condition as human beings. That's part of our crazy condition. But it's also part of our potential freedom. So even though we're dealing with some of that, existential anxiety, we are also expanding our ability to venture out, to risk, to create. And the combination of the two is what intensifies our experience of living, seems to me, the poignancy of living. For God's sakes, without the sense of high stakes and of potential loss and of death, how are you going to appreciate the life that's in front of you? Or the project or the relationship, or the sense of participating in something much greater than oneself.
So, I mean, much of what I read when I read your book is, and I haven't read all your work, I've scanned bits, but it seems still fundamentally Rollo May, as I keep hearing,
Oh,
and
yeah.
no doubt other great existentialists that influenced him.
Yes.
I understand you were a student. Could you just share a little bit of your experience with Rollo May, and then how do you think you took it differently or further?
Rollo was a very straightforward guy. It's one of the things I really loved about him. He told it like it was, like he felt it, in a in a civil and caring way, but he was quite honest and straightforward about his views. Another thing that struck me, and I think we resonated a lot on, was how he he had problems with oversimplification, and he often wanted to see the other side of things. So, like the paradoxes of living, which his mentor Paul Tillich also
Oh,
very
yeah.
much celebrated. And for Rollo, that was what led to the fuller life, was to recognize that we are fragile, vulnerable beings, and that has its own beauty and attunement to our living experience, our sensitivities, but that we also have a great capacity to transcend that smallness and that vulnerability, and to venture out and to take risks and to be bold, curious, create. And he lived that with his writings, his own artistry. He did beautiful watercolors.
I remember his book, The Quest for Beauty.
My Quest for Beauty.
Yeah, somebody took that book, but I lost it way back in the 90s. But it
I
was a
hope you get
beautiful
it
book.
back.
That was a beautiful book.
Well, and he talks about his nervous breakdown in
Oh,
that
does
book
he? I don't
too.
remember.
And we share that in common too. I
Okay.
had a very challenging episode, a couple episodes in my life.
That's in your book,
So,
Life Enhancing Anxiety, I believe.
yes, that's right. Yeah, I very much talk about my personal trajectory, my personal story.
Yeah.
In dealing with life, dealing with anxiety, and then life enhancing anxiety. But yeah, anxiety was extremely important for Rollo too. And I see this book in so many ways as an homage to his work.
Yeah.
His 1950, his dissertation, The Meaning of Anxiety,
Yep.
came out as The Meaning of Anxiety in book form. And it's really an attempt to bring out many of the dimensions that Rollo was speaking to in the 50s for our current generation, which has really even more so lost track of the potential virtues in experiencing some of the vital discomforts that can lead to fuller and more peaceable and more what's the word? Just more vital lifestyles and collective ways of being.
Yep. So we've got about 3 minutes left. It's amazing how fast time flies.
Yes.
Can you hook for me the fluid center idea
Yeah.
with groundlessness? I'm gonna sensing those probably go together.
Yes.
And what you do in your experiential democratic dialogue briefly. I know there's different videos online and stuff, so in a couple minutes, can you quickly give us a sense of that?
Well, I define the fluid center as experiencing or as engaging the richest parameters of experience within the most suitable frameworks of support, something to that effect. And it goes right to what we were talking about before. It's finding that ground within groundlessness. I think it relates to what you talk about with fearlessness. It's a capacity to, yes, to expand along with the recognition and the humility that we can't do everything. We aren't gods. We are vulnerable. So to expand within the limits and the givens of our existence, and to find the most free and expansive way to live within those parameters and given the present context that we're in. So it's always fluid, it's always becoming, it's evolving, and it's aware of the need for some constraint so that so that we can keep it together, so that and we can deepen our experience as opposed to being scattered all over.
So democratic dialogue.
So yeah, experiential democracy dialogue is really about helping people to the degree possible within that kind of setting to develop greater presence to them within themselves and between.
So it's just like peer-to-peer.
Yes, it's peer-to-peer, and it brings people together from highly contrasting backgrounds. Could be liberal conservative, could be religious, non-religious, racial divergence. But the point being that experiential democracy dialogue is a very intimate form of helping people to relate to each other more as human beings rather than labels or stereotypes. And just the initial phase, it's a 6-phase model. The initial phase, before even engaging with each other, is to visualize what it might be like to sit with that person who is so different